Welcome to episode 24 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Addressing poverty in education is something we hear about all the time. And this isn't anything new either. President Lyndon B. Johnson first declared war on poverty in his State of the Union address in January 1964. And about 8 months later, he was signing what was officially called the Economic Opportunity Act. The Declaration on War on Poverty was met with both acclaim and criticism. I think we can all agree, however, that it put the topic at the forefront. Fast forward now to the present. Tomorrow is the 20th of August, which will mark the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Economic Opportunity Act, and we're still talking about how to best address poverty. Only, many of us think of poverty only in terms of money. To be in poverty means to lack financial means. But poverty is so much more, which is where my guest comes in today. Sherry Slankard is a counselor at a rural elementary school. Prior to this, she was a counselor in a junior high setting for 15 years. Moreover, Sherry grew up in rural poverty and uses her story to help educate people all over. I'll never forget, about 2 years ago, several of my staff members went to hear Sherry speak at a summer workshop. They came back energized and impacted by their day with her. So much so that I called Sherry a couple weeks later to talk with her more on the topic, and I got her to write for the Illinois ASCD. Most recently, my district brought Sherry in last Thursday for a half-day teacher workshop on further understanding rural poverty. I think you're going to enjoy today's episode. Sherry, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Hello.
So, today's episode, we're talking about understanding rural poverty. And what makes your experience so powerful is that you grew up in generational poverty, and you're very open about this, and you've shared your experiences at workshops and articles that you've written, and really all over. So, I was wondering if maybe you could share with the audience a little about your generational poverty experiences.
Sure. I am very open about my experiences. Just a side note, I know that my situation is mild compared to many of the families that I've worked with.
Sure.
But I do share those experiences because when I'm doing workshops, it helps to explain the concepts that I'm trying to get across regarding poverty. But it started with both of my parents. They had very primitive beginnings. My grandmother became very ill at a very young age. So she was placed in a long term facility that left my grandpa to raise six kids on his own.
Oh, wow.
He was an amazing man, hilarious. And so that's where I do a lot of stories about my family because they're so funny.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was left to raise the kids. But just imagine the struggle he had in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, sure.
And then my mom, just imagine her growing up without a mother her siblings. So that had to have been a stress. So my mom and my dad got together, and they had different mindsets. So my mom became a single mom, and the struggles that come along with that. Push forward to me. I was a single mom living in government housing and on the system. So when I look back, I think about all those champions that were in my life that helped me survive, basically. Um, there was a neighbor up the road. His name was Lauren McCann. He took me to church, had the old man's candy, and made sure I went to church every Sunday, which nowadays would seem really bizarre, but he just wanted to make sure I knew about Jesus. And so he made sure he came by every Sunday to get me for church. And it was so important to him. My parents didn't go to church. So when it came time for me to be baptized, there was like a pond in front of our house, like an old pond.
Uh-huh.
And so he brought the church to the house. And my parents obviously lived there. So
Yeah.
he brought the church to my parents, which was pretty cool. So, and I know every time I talk about my situation, I always talk about my grandma Dorothy. She was my solid. She was my safe place, and I think that because of her, I strive to be like her just with unconditionally caring about people and trying to do the right thing. So it's just these people in life when it comes to students and families that do the extraordinary things that have the biggest impact on the kids.
Well, what about you said the gentleman that took you to church, and you mentioned that your parents didn't go to church. I mean, was was that ever an issue between your parents and you, or between?
No.
No.
No, no, that was never an issue. They just didn't go. I don't think that they believed, or my dad especially believed, but that was okay. He did the best he could, and he planted roots with me and got me to church, and I still have my faith to this day.
And so now today you are a school counselor in a rural community, uh,
Hmm.
but this wasn't always the case. And you overcame generational poverty, as you've described, to go back to school and to receive your degree. What kind of commitment did that take at a time when you've talked about your resources and the government housing and everything? Your resources were limited.
Right. And again, we'll talk about this here in a little bit, but resources was just not about the financial. There was, emotional and low self-esteem and a lot of things that come along with that, which I'm very open about when I talk to educators. But I get this question a lot because I think that we're looking for a one size fits all answer to help people bridge that gap and get out of their situation. But it took me a long time. I actually started working in a factory,
Hmm.
which did provide financial resources. But I remember some people from Eastern came into the factory to talk about this program that they were offering for adults. And I remember the only reason I went to the meeting was because I got off the line for a while. So it took me took me
Right.
off the line to go hear this spiel from these people. Well, they shared a bunch of information about some grants and student loans, and I was thinking, oh, that's extra money to live on. So I thought I'll go for it. So I ended up taking a couple classes every semester. And finally, at the age of 32, I finally finished my degree. So it took me a long time.
And so about how many years did it take
Well,
to get to that?
well I was a single mom from the time I was 20, 21 until 32. Well, I was actually 34. So 14 years. It took me a long time.
And I think that that's something that is important, and maybe that's beyond the scope of today's interview, but it really, so it took a long time, but that's not the
Hmm.
point. The point is that you had a
Hmm.
goal and you got there.
Well, and honestly, I don't know that I just kept a lot of it was for resources. So I took those classes because it was a resource and it provided, different things. I got, money for gas and things like that, as long as I stayed in the program. So there was a hidden agenda on my part, not necessarily thinking of toward to getting a degree. Um, and what actually turned out was I ended up working in a counseling center as a secretary, and I develop relationships with people. That's where I'm from.
Uh-huh.
Relationships are the centerpiece. And so while working there, I had the one of the counselors. She said, you really ought to go into social service work. And so that's when I jumped into the master's program. And while in the master's program, I had a professor who said I should go into school. And so it's just funny how different people are put in your lives to direct you on the path
Absolutely.
that you're meant to be on. So.
Now you hit on this just a minute ago, and we're going to dive into it because I think we often find a misconception when we talk about poverty is that people assume we're just talking about a lack of money, and that is certainly one piece of it. But it's often so much more. Can you talk about lack of other resources that can also be defined as poverty?
Sure, sure. Um, like you said, it's just not about financial. Financial is important, but it's just one of many. There's emotional, so your self-esteem, your responses to things, your mental. If you have some mental illness, or even just your ability to learn, like to read and write, things like that. If you're constantly distracted by stressors in your life, that just gets in the way of your ability to learn. Spiritual, if you believe, and that doesn't necessarily mean a religion. That's just having a belief and having a purpose. I always say that some of my kids, and this is from the Ruby Payne group, but it really stuck with me that a lot of kids don't have a future story. They just don't connect the things that they're doing to their future. And that's that part where that spiritual comes in. If you don't have a future story, that's a resource that you need. Physical, being physically healthy. Um, and oftentimes, you know, I know that I hear, a lot of them go to the e-room and they expire all their resources and things like that. But I always talk about I have a bad leg, I have a bad hip. And so looking back, if I didn't have access to the insurance and things I have at this age, I don't know what my situation would be like with my hip. So I was able to go to a university to have, my hip replaced and things like that. And I talk about that also because if living on the welfare system, my access to good quality specialists probably wouldn't be there.
Right.
Um, and then support systems, just having people, having friends, family, just that group of people. Like my grandma Dorothy was just incredible. She was my support system above anybody. She was the one I always would talk to because no matter what stupid thing I did, she was okay. She wasn't okay with it, but she just
Right.
loved me anyway. It's just that support. And then just role models. I talked about the various ones throughout my life, and then just knowing hidden rules. And hidden rules are things that I always tell people, just because you think it's common sense doesn't mean it's common sense to everybody. And please make sure the things that you expect from people, if
Uh-huh.
they're really that important, make sure you know. An example, this sounds really stupid, but just putting the toilet paper the right direction, that's a hidden rule of mine.
Oh,
And
sure.
you know what I mean? Just little things that sounds that's a silly example, but just those little things that you expect of people, if you don't have the hidden rules of middle class or of a different or even just a different culture family and you're trying to interact, if you don't know those hidden rules, you can absolutely offend people.
And so you mentioned the knowledge of hidden rules. How do you gain that knowledge?
Well, I think it has to be taught. um, you know and an example I always use with people, it's hard to explain hidden rules, since it's hard for some people to understand the concept of a hidden rule because you're raised in your situation and you know what's right according to the way you're raised. The way I describe it is I love football. Absolutely love the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Okay.
I've loved.
We won't hold that against you.
Okay, good. But I've just always, in fact, in high school, I was a stat for the football team. I've just always been involved, loved football. Can't play it, but I like to watch it.
Sure.
But anyway, but I know the rules of football. Absolutely know those rules. And so if I'm playing football and I know those rules and I'm thrown into a game of basketball, can you imagine the outcome?
Right.
So they're,
Completely different set of rules
yeah,
there.
absolutely. And so it's just, it's not that I can't learn the rules of basketball. I just don't know them. I know football. And so when I explain it like that, it kind of helps make sense.
Could it be, I guess, equivalent to what to keep with the sports analogy?
Hmm.
And I hear this probably more in baseball than any other sport, but they talk about the unwritten rules,
Hmm.
the rules that for example, if a batter hits a home run, they should not take time to admire their hit because it's disrespectful to the pitcher. Um,
Absolutely.
I mean, is that kind of the same thing, that there are rules out there that you should respect?
Right. But the problem though is some from poverty don't know them. And
Okay.
so even though they should respect those hidden rules when they come into a school or an agency, they don't know them. They really
Sure.
may not just know them. And so, I had which I a principal at where my son goes to school. He did an incredible job. It was a program, and so he was going through specific, I mean, very detailed what someone say common sense rules. Like
Uh-huh.
some people around me were saying, like, this is a waste of time. We all know these rules, but I knew what he was doing. He was telling those who didn't know what he expected at that program what to do and how to behave. And I thought that was just fantastic. I thought this guy's got it figured out. So, but you
Okay.
don't hear that doesn't happen very often. We just expect people to know how to behave or what we expect of them. And especially in classrooms, we expect kids to know how to, you come into my classroom and this is what you need to do. Instead, I'll have a teacher send a kid down breaking the same rule. I'm like, well, did you explain this is your rule and why it's true, why it's important? And oftentimes it's no, they should know better.
Oh yes, I hear that a lot. But
Hmm.
but having the why defined behind the rules, can have a tremendous impact and change the course of behavior.
Sure, absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about the stressors of poverty, but we often fail, I think, to recognize, the impact it can have on childhood trauma, at least until it's too late.
Yeah.
Now, I think it would be wise to spend maybe a little bit of time talking about childhood trauma and the possible effects it has on our students.
Sure. And I think, when we think of trauma, oftentimes people think of something scary, violent, extreme event. But when we're talking about kids in poverty, um, it's different. They live their trauma every day. It's like they have chronic stress from just their daily struggles. Um, for example, an example I use, and I'm a storyteller, so forgive me for
Oh,
all my examples.
we love stories on Anchored in Education.
Okay,
Tell
great.
all you want.
Okay. Well, and I the way I explain it to adults who don't understand that, and we call it tiring of the moment. But imagine, just I've tried to get them to put themselves in what this feels like. You're looking out the window, and this massive tornado is coming straight at you. Are you going to be thinking about that math test at that moment, or are you going to be thinking about survival, right?
Right, absolutely.
And so that stress that you're feeling right there is what these kids deal with all the time. And so when they're constantly dealing with that chronic stress, I mean, there's lots of information out there about, how it releases all these different things in their brains develop differently. And there's lots of research as far as that goes. But it's just important to understand that that's where they're coming from and that's the trauma that they live with. I mean, and it can, you'll see kids with, I compare it to like sometimes they get diagnosed with ADHD or various, mental issues,
Uh huh.
psychological issues, when really it's just a short attention span. They might have a meltdown, they might have anxiety, or those symptoms, when really it's just the stress that they're dealing with.
I'm taken back to a conversation you and I had. This is probably close to 2 years ago, and you were telling me about a child in your district who was falling asleep in class,
Yeah.
and it was the reaction. And I don't know that it's a fault to the teacher, but the reaction was this child's always falling asleep in my class.
Hmm.
They're not being respectful. They need to sleep at home. And when you talk to the child, they express to you that I believe it was holes in the
Yes,
floor.
I tell this story a lot because I think sometimes, we see behaviors and we don't understand why the behaviors and they seem like disrespect or or whatever. And sometimes kids are often, they say, oh, they've been up playing video games all night, and that, you get this judgment
Sure,
sometimes. And so I just take time to spend with them and kind of learn what's going on with them. But this little girl, they had holes in their floor, and when she had seen the snake pop through the holes multiple times, and so she was scared to go to sleep because she's afraid that that snake would come through the floor at night while she was sleeping. So she couldn't sleep at home. She didn't feel safe.
I mean that's a huge stressor
Oh my
on
gosh.
on that child. And again, I mean that even goes back to what you said at the beginning of this conversation, that uh, to really dive into understanding rural poverty is about relationships.
Yes.
And I mean, so I think that story had a happy ending. You were able to get some resources to the family, but
Yeah.
somebody had to ask, somebody had
Hmm.
to dive in, because I really, without questioning that student, I'm not sure that she was going to bring that up. I can't say for certain.
Not, I mean, and sometimes they don't because, what happens is if they say certain things are happening at home, it sometimes reflects on their parents, and then, services, DCFS, and things like that get involved, and they're very careful about what they share with their teachers and things like that.
Sure.
Um, and it takes time to develop those relationships. And teachers, I mean, educators don't always have time to spend like I do, and it worked out okay. And the teacher is a wonderful person, but it's
Right.
just simply knowing that she was falling asleep and it was becoming a disciplinary situation because she was sleeping in class
Right.
and not doing the things. We get so caught up in the math and the language and things that they got to learn in our standards that we forget about the whole child, and there's a whole lot more to that child. And if
Oh,
there's a behavior cropping up in class, oftentimes there's something else that we need to find out.
I'm gonna shift just slightly on you here
Hmm.
to talk about mental models, which to quickly define, mental models are deeply held beliefs on how the world works. So let's
Hmm.
talk about them for a minute.
Okay.
You've said before that people often operate off their own mental models and personal experiences, and with these come biases, which for most people aren't even aware. Can you
Right.
help us understand how mental models create barriers between people of different classes?
I think that, you're raised with your own set of beliefs and things like that, and that's your normal. And so anything that's different from what you already think is correct is hard to understand. And oftentimes things that are hard to understand become judged, like we judge like they're lazy and things like that.
Hmm.
And they get this, thought about that person, instead of learning, trying to understand them. And it's not just people from middle class, it's poverty, it's everyone, it's just everyone.
Sure.
An example, not even regarding social classes. I told you about the fellow that took me to church. Well, it was a Baptist church,
Uh
is
huh.
where I went to church. And so imagine when I met my husband, who was Catholic. And so I always tell this story to people, and they're like, oh, I get the reaction like,
Yeah.
oh, because there's this stereotype. And so, there's judgments that come along with that. And oftentimes people will, go off your stereotypes and go off of the things that you think, instead of trying to learn more. So instead of jumping to that, I call it the judgment train.
Yeah.
Um, I took a class about it because I liked this guy and I wanted to learn more about what he was believing in, and so then it makes more sense. And just like with my families, um, from wherever, if I don't understand it, I try to jump in and learn more about why they're making the choices that they are. And I think that's sometimes where we get caught up, and even just like with the mental models, we can even throw that into like the politics. There's so many beliefs and so many ideas on things that no one's taken time to understand anybody.
Oh, sure.
So it becomes, it's not it's it applies a lot of different ways.
Well, and I mean, as you talk about politics, that could be in any state or even local or the federal government.
Hmm.
But I mean, I think we're seeing that, um, and talking about how the mental models are creating barriers. I mean, it's doing that in society right
Yeah.
now, and
Yeah.
a lot of times, it maybe it sounds like a broken record. I'm sure I've said it one too many times, but it's about the ability to listen to the other side, to understand the other side. And it's not necessarily to say that you must agree or
Right.
that, but you have to at least acknowledge.
Absolutely.
So,
You,
yeah.
an example, I do this activity with, and I had a college class with families in my school, um, and it was on a social emotion or social economic class. And so I've been with parents, and I did this activities with my families of poverty and teachers. And so I want them to explore their mindset, explore their beliefs and things like that. And it's interesting, I always hear from the middle class group that those in poverty are lazy.
Hmm.
And it's just something and I always bring that up. And I always pull up a slide because I did this with a group of generational poverty families, and they describe middle class as lazy. And so when I pull up the slide of what they described as middle class, can you imagine the reaction that they get? Like, how dare they judge me for that?
Right.
And so I'm like, it's just a matter of looking at it from a different view.
You've mentioned before that most schools, businesses, and other agencies operate from a middle class mindset. And I found this interesting when I first read it, and now I'd like to maybe find out more.
Okay. I, I think that a lot of those who are working in like those agencies are from a middle class background. It's about achievement. And so, your teachers probably had good experiences in school, social workers and such. They were able to go to college. And so those, they're running those, um, facilities, I guess
Hmm.
is the word I'm trying to look for, from a middle class mindset. Um, and so families with more of a poverty mindset go into those, and they don't necessarily understand um, the hidden rules that go along with that. Because in middle class, your driving force is achievement. Like you achieve, you want to do well. Your kids go to college, and in poverty, it's more about your relationships with people. So, and if you are from poverty and your situation in school sometimes was terrible, so you're very distrustful of those who work in schools. So it becomes a barrier. Certainly becomes a barrier sometimes.
Sure. And coming from your own example that you gave us, that school wasn't even, I mean, it wasn't about school.
Right.
It was about something completely different, which, I mean, it benefited you
Sure.
exponentially. I mean, afterwards, but that wasn't the goal. And you even said that's not what I'm guessing that Sherry of that time taking classes wasn't looking to Sherry now and thinking this is
Right.
where you would be.
No, and in fact, I'm amazed every day of the blessings that I've received, because that person back then is totally not the same person as I am today. And there's some shame that goes along with that because of the poor choices and just the things that that happened. Um, However, I think that everything in life, gets you where you're going and where you're supposed to be in life. But it wasn't always an easy time.
Well, and not only that, you've written on this before um, that there was after you finished school that people didn't readily or quickly accept that you had changed.
Right. It changes your relationships with your family, and even with old friends, because they're used to the old person, and your friends change because you're not the same person that you used to be. And then along with that comes judgment, you know.
Yep.
So because who do you think you are? That kind of stuff.
Sure. All right. So, in addition to, you facilitate workshops and you facilitate poverty simulations, you're also highly active in addressing the lack of mental health services in rural communities. I guess this would kind of go back to the saying of it takes a village to raise a child. So, what kind of services should we be seeking for our communities that could help with childhood trauma brought on by generational poverty?
Well, I think just becoming more vocal and ending the stigma of mental health and mental illness, because it and trying to facilitate those services to those mental health agencies. In my community, I was very vocal about the lack of resources and the access that some of the families had to those. And so because I spoke to those influential people, those key players in the community, and through that I ended up on several committees at the hospital addressing the community needs. And I loudly spoke over and over, like, we need more mental health services in this community. And I wasn't the only one. There were several people that were part of that with me, that understood the need. And through that, I know that our community the hospital has employed social workers and counselors. Our clinic has brought in more people, and they're really doing a very good job of trying to up that need. But also, um, just training people on like, there's mental health first aid, and I'm sure there's lots of other trainings that are out there, just to train people on the importance of it. If you had diabetes, you would go get treatment, but if you have a mental illness, it's a stigma, and people think you're, the term crazy, which I hate that.
Right.
So just bringing awareness to the importance of it.
Now, before we go, I hope by now our listeners are wondering what are the first steps that they can take towards better understanding the students and families with whom they are interacting. Now, you've said many times, and you're going to say it again, relationships.
I
That
will.
that's the key component and the first step. But you've even gone as far as to say that it must start with empathy, trust, and accountability, and in that order.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us about these three steps in building relationships of mutual respect?
Sure. I just feel like oftentimes families and just people in general, it's hard to trust. And if in building that relationship, if you take time to understand. I always tell kids, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Just try to understand, and just note, just you're never going to fully understand what they have dealt with in their situation in their life, because you're not in their shoes. But do your best to understand. And once they see that compassion and that concern, um, they're going to be more likely to trust, as long as you don't have some kind of a motive behind your relationship. And
Right.
they will pick up on that, because I'll tell you what, people can read through that. But if you're genuinely wanting to be a part and have that relationship, work on that empathy. Once trust comes, then my goodness, the things that you can accomplish, because kids will learn if there's trust. And they'll be more open to, like, accountability. So for example, if it's a student who's difficult, or a parent who's difficult, if they trust that you're trying to do the right thing, they're going to be more open to being held accountable for their part in, or their role in it.
All right, Sherry, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Well, thank you for having me.
See, I told you today was going to be a good episode. And you can follow Sherry on Twitter today. Search at Sherry Slankard to find her. Or head over to escottengland.com and click on the Read More link to read more about Sherry and find resources. Before I close out today's episode, let me remind you one more time to subscribe to Anchored in Education so you can be notified every time a new episode is available. There are so many layers to understanding poverty, and it's not like it comes with a manual. People are not sitting at home looking over their list of hidden rules. They don't have to, because as we learned today, hidden rules are understood by those in the situation. And like everything else, it is possible to learn the hidden rules, but that should serve only as our guide to how to approach poverty. I like Sherry's story because of the candidness. She grew up in poverty, but never felt like it. She went back to college, but not with becoming anchored in education in mind. I'm thankful she did, though. I'm thankful for the opportunity to learn from her and how I can help students. Not everyone is as fortunate to have the story Sherry has. That's why I'm joining her in the quest to better address rural poverty and get the necessary assistance and supports in our communities. Because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.